In the majestic halls of Mount Olympus, far above the clouds, the gods and goddesses of Greek mythology lived in a world of grandeur and power. They were thought to hold dominion over the elements, the seasons, and human fate itself. Yet, despite their divine status, these mighty beings were not immune to the trials and tribulations of daily life. In fact, one of the most pressing challenges for many of them was the issue of sleep. But why? If the gods could command the heavens and the earth, surely they could command rest too. Or could they? It might seem absurd to think of beings who could alter the flow of time or hurl lightning from their hands, struggling with the simple need for sleep. However, if we look closer, we realize that their very immortality and divine nature made their relationship with sleep unique, and at times deeply problematic. Let's start with the story of Zeus, the king of the gods. Zeus, lord of the sky, thunder, and justice, was often depicted as the ruler of both men and gods. But behind his grand title, Zeus found himself perpetually busy. As the god of the sky, his responsibilities included not just overseeing the weather, but managing the fates of mortal men and the intricate web of divine politics. If anyone deserved rest, it was surely Zeus. But even he was said to find sleep elusive. In many ancient tales, Zeus's sleep was described as troubled, fraught with dreams and visions that blurred the line between divine wisdom and personal doubt. On one occasion, Zeus, exhausted from a long bout of overseeing mortal affairs, attempted to retreat to his chamber and sleep. Yet even as he lay upon his golden bed, visions of wars, revolutions, and betrayals plagued him. How could he rest when the world below was in such chaos? Perhaps this is why he often sought solace in the arms of his numerous lovers, an attempt to escape the relentless stress of ruling both gods and men. Still, sleep seemed to slip through his fingers, often just out of reach, as he stared at the endless horizon from his high throne. But was this truly a matter of divine weariness? Or was it something more subtle, something to do with the nature of immortality itself? Even if the gods could rest, what of their dreams? Was their sleep truly peaceful, or did their immortal minds continue to churn, weighed down by an unending stream of thoughts and responsibilities? Perhaps the gods' inability to rest was an allegory for the burdens of leadership, or a reminder that power and immortality come at a great personal cost. In any case, it seems that sleep, like the gods themselves, was elusive, even for the mighty Zeus. But Zeus was not the only one. Consider Hera, his wife and the queen of the gods. Hera was a goddess of marriage, family, and childbirth. Like Zeus, she was often portrayed as one of the more serious gods, a figure of dignity and authority. Yet, her position as wife of the most powerful god on Olympus meant that she too was burdened with the affairs of both gods and mortals. As a result, her nights were often spent in troubled sleep, filled with dreams of betrayal and revenge. Hera's sleep was not peaceful. It was often filled with restless thoughts about her husband's numerous affairs and the mortal women he seduced. Did she ever truly sleep soundly, or did her mind remain forever alert to the dramas of Olympus? And then there was Apollo, the god of the sun, music, and prophecy. Apollo's duties were extensive. He controlled the sun's path across the sky, oversaw music and poetry, and even had a hand in guiding human destinies. Apollo, however, was not immune to the occasional need for rest, but his sleep was often depicted as erratic. In some stories, he would sleep for days, only to awaken at the crack of dawn, ready to resume his duties as though nothing had happened. But how could Apollo, who brought light to the world each day, ever rest in a world that was constantly bathed in his light? question remains, if even the gods of Olympus, who possess the power to shape the world, could not find peace in sleep, what did this say about their existence? Was sleep simply too mundane for their extraordinary lives? Or was it something more? Perhaps a reminder that no matter how powerful one may be, even the divine could not escape the universal need for rest. As we delve deeper into the nocturnal struggles of the gods, it's clear that their sleep was not merely a mundane human need, but a reflection of their divine natures, filled with complexity and contradictions. Even those gods who were known for their wisdom and composure, like Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, were not exempt from the inner turmoil that disturbed their rest. Athena, unlike her brother Apollo, was not burdened by the weight of the sun's rays. Yet, her role as a strategist in the wars of gods and mortals caused her mind to never truly rest. Though she was revered for her intellect and clarity of thought, she, too, found sleep elusive. How could she sleep when the lives of mortals and immortals were at stake? How could she close her eyes when there were so many strategic moves yet to be made, wars to be won, and battles to be planned? Stories from ancient sources suggest that Athena's dreams were filled with the echoes of battlefield cries and the faces of soldiers, those whose fate she controlled. The goddess of wisdom, then, was constantly confronted by her own need to balance her responsibilities as a divine being and as a ruler of war. Did her mind ever find respite? Or did her dreams only fuel her need for control? In one myth, she is said to have dreamed of guiding heroes into battle, instructing them in their final moments. Was this a gift, a divine duty, or a curse? Could the dreams of a goddess reflect a desire for peace, or were they merely the consequences of eternal vigilance? But perhaps the most curious case of divine restlessness lies with the god of sleep himself, Hypnos. Hypnos, though a deity of slumber, was not immune to the turmoil of his own realm. Even though he was responsible for sending others into restful sleep, Hypnos himself often struggled with his own. His domain was one of quietude, yet it is said that even he, at times, could not escape the overwhelming silence of his realm. What did Hypnos dream of in the stillness? Was his role as the god of sleep a reflection of his own subconscious need for escape from an endless, tiring responsibility? One tale tells of how Hypnos, despite his mastery over sleep, found himself unable to rest when his brother, Thanatos, the god of death, was disturbed by the chaos of the mortal realm. Thanatos' work was grim and often unruly, but Hypnos found it increasingly difficult to sleep when his brother's disquiet overshadowed his own rest. If sleep itself could become restless, what did that say about the gods who controlled it? And yet, even the least active gods, such as Hestia, goddess of the hearth, were not exempt from the toll of eternal wakefulness. While she did not involve herself in the machinations of the world as Zeus or Athena did, she too had a domain to tend to, the sacred hearth and the flame that burned in every home and temple. This eternal fire, while a symbol of warmth and safety, was also a source of unyielding responsibility. The hearth had to burn night and day, and Hestia's watchful gaze ensured that it never faltered. Could this perpetual vigilance allow her any peace? The gods' troubles with sleep might seem trivial compared to their vast and powerful domains. After all, what are the sleepless nights of immortals in comparison to the struggles of humans? Yet the myths of the gods of Olympus suggest that immortality itself, far from offering endless rest, instead brought with it the burdens of leadership, duty, and an unrelenting watch over the cosmos. For gods like Hera and Athena, It was their very nature to be constantly alert, to watch and guide the lives of those around them. Could it be that the gods, in their eternal existence, were forever haunted by their responsibilities? As the gods' restless nights continued, a curious pattern began to emerge. The more powerful and responsible a deity was, the more they struggled with sleep. Perhaps the mythological accounts of these troubled nights were meant to serve as a subtle commentary on the consequences of power. Was sleep, in this sense, not merely a physical need, but a symbol of the constant vigilance required of those who govern both gods and men? But if even the mightiest of the gods couldn't rest, how did mortals fare? Could they find solace in the very sleep that the gods found so elusive? Or was it possible that the gods' troubled sleep was a reflection of the deeper tensions within Greek society itself? Tensions between power, responsibility, and the search for personal peace. As we come to the final part of our journey through the sleepless nights of the gods, it's important to consider what we can learn from their troubled slumbers. The gods, for all their majesty and power, were deeply human in their struggles with rest. Despite their divine status, their sleep was fraught with the same kinds of worries and anxieties that plague mortals. Theirs was not a peaceful existence, free from the stresses of life, but one deeply entangled in the webs of responsibility and consequence. Their sleep, like their lives, was a battleground, and their inability to find rest offers a poignant commentary on the burdens of power and immortality. For Zeus, the king of the gods, his troubled sleep was a reflection of the toll of leadership. As the ruler of Olympus, he was burdened with decisions that affected both gods and humans. How could he rest when the weight of the world, quite literally, was on his shoulders? Even when he sought peace, it was elusive, interrupted by visions and dreams of war, betrayal, and unrest. His lack of rest was not just a physical limitation, but a symbol of the exhausting nature of leadership. The price of power was not just a heavy crown, but the inability to find peace. Hera's sleepless nights, filled with thoughts of her husband's infidelities, reflect another aspect of the human condition: jealousy and insecurity. Even the Queen of the Gods, revered for her wisdom and stature, was not immune to these deeply human emotions. Her restlessness offers a lesson in the way that personal doubts can disrupt even the most seemingly secure of lives. Even within the divine realm, no one is free from the weight of emotional turmoil, and sleep, it seems, could offer no escape. Apollo's sleep, too, carries a deeper meaning. As the god of the sun, music, and prophecy, Apollo's eternal wakefulness symbolized the burden of enlightenment. To bear the light of knowledge was to never truly rest, to always be vigilant in the pursuit of truth and understanding. His restless sleep, or lack thereof, teaches us that the pursuit of knowledge, though valuable, comes at a cost. Perhaps like Apollo, we are never fully at ease when we strive to understand the world and our place within it. The more we know, the less peace we seem to find. But it was Hypnos, the god of sleep himself, who perhaps provides the most poignant lesson. Despite his role in sending others into restful slumber, Hypnos' own inability to find peace shows us that even the most powerful forces can be vulnerable. Even the god of sleep is not exempt from the restlessness that comes with the duties of immortality. His own troubled sleep suggests that no matter how much power one holds, no one is free from the universal struggles that affect us all. What, then, does all this say about the nature of immortality? If even the gods could not escape the trials of sleep, does that mean that immortality itself is a curse, rather than a blessing? The gods of Olympus, despite their vast powers, were constantly battling against the forces of time, responsibility, and internal unrest. Their inability to rest, their troubled dreams, and their emotional burdens offer a glimpse into the price of divinity, an endless existence marked not by peace, but by a relentless cycle of duties, anxieties, and unfulfilled desires. For mortals, the lessons are clear. The gods' struggles with sleep remind us that power and responsibility, while often coveted, come with their own sets of challenges. The restless nights of the gods teach us that even those who seem invincible are not immune to the trials of the mind and body. Sleep, in this sense, becomes a metaphor for balance, something that even the gods themselves struggle to find. And in that struggle, we see the human condition mirrored in its purest form. In the end, the gods' sleepless nights raise an intriguing question. Could their inability to rest be a reflection of their immortality? Perhaps the endless demands placed on their divine selves made it impossible for them to find true peace, a stark contrast to the fleeting nature of human life. The gods, in their eternal existence, may have found that the cost of never-ending life was the inability to experience the simple yet profound peace of a good night's sleep. The gods' restlessness then speaks to a deeper truth about existence itself. Sleep, in its most basic form, is a necessity for all living beings, no matter their stature or power. Even the gods of Olympus, despite their divine gifts, were not free from the universal need for rest. Their troubled sleep may not just reflect their personal struggles, but a more profound truth about the limitations of immortality and the human need for peace. As you drift off into your own peaceful slumber, perhaps you can find comfort in the knowledge that even the gods of Olympus were not immune to the wearying effects of sleeplessness. And like them, you too must find your rest, as the cycle of day and night continues to turn, regardless of who or what you are. When we think of medieval times, it's often the kings, queens, knights, and castles that dominate our imaginations. The grandeur of royal courts and the valor of knights in shining armor are the stories that have been passed down through the ages. However, there is a much quieter, often overlooked story, that of the medieval peasant. These were the people who made up the majority of the population in medieval Europe, yet their lives were rarely chronicled in the annals of history. They were the farmers, labourers, and craftsmen who worked the land, often under the watchful eye of a lord or a monastery. But what was life like for them? How did they manage their daily routines? And what was their experience of sleep in a world dominated by hard work and scarce comforts? In the feudal system, peasants were bound to the land and under the control of a lord, a system that left them with little autonomy. The vast majority of peasants were serfs, not slaves, but their freedoms were severely restricted. They could not leave the land without the lord's permission, and their lives were dictated by the seasons, the crops they grew, and the labor required to sustain the local economy. A typical day for a medieval peasant began before dawn. As the sun began to rise, so did they, pulling themselves out of bed in small, cramped homes that offered little warmth or comfort. These homes, often made of wood and thatch, had 1 or 2 rooms where the entire family lived, slept and ate. The bed itself was little more than a heap of straw, with a few thin blankets to ward off the chill of the early morning air. The concept of a mattress, as we know it today, was a luxury most peasants could not afford. Once awake, the first task of the day was usually the most pressing: getting food for the family. This was not as simple as walking to the fridge. Peasant families typically had small gardens or relied on the crops they grew to provide their meals. Some peasants also kept small livestock, such as chickens or pigs, which provided eggs, milk, or meat. But much of their work was tied to the land they worked for the Lord. This work was grueling, demanding long hours of physical labor. The men would often work in the fields, while the women tended to the household and animals. The rhythm of the day was dictated by the seasons. In spring and summer, peasants spent long hours planting, tending, and harvesting crops, with little time for rest. In autumn, there was the rush to gather the harvest before the rains or frosts arrived. Winter was the one season that offered some respite. But even then, the work never truly stopped. Firewood had to be chopped, animals had to be cared for, and there was always something to mend or prepare for the coming season. The work itself was monotonous, exhausting, and often physically painful. Backbreaking labor was the norm, whether it was plowing fields, gathering firewood, or tending to animals. Peasants did not have the luxury of modern tools or machinery. They relied on basic farming implements like plows and sickles, which required manual labor and constant repair. Life for the medieval peasant was a never-ending cycle of work and rest, with little room for leisure or personal enjoyment. But amidst this grueling existence, one must wonder, how did peasants find time for rest? And more importantly, how did they sleep after a long day of physical exertion? It's hard to imagine how the back-breaking labor of the fields could be alleviated by a few hours of sleep on a bed made of straw. But the truth is, the concept of rest and sleep was very different in the medieval world. Sleep was not a luxury. It was a necessity, albeit a fleeting one. As night fell, peasants would return to their homes, exhausted and often hungry. With the absence of artificial light, the evening hours were dictated by the setting of the sun. Once it was dark, the family would gather around the hearth or a small fire, and the night's meal would be prepared. But sleep didn't always come easily. In the cold and damp conditions of medieval homes, it was common for people to sleep in shifts, especially during the colder months when heat was scarce. The whole family would huddle together for warmth, and sleep was often interrupted by the need to tend to the fire, or by the sounds of animals or the outside world. Peasants slept in the same room in which they lived and worked, and this created a unique and challenging situation when it came to sleep. There were few comforts to be had. No soft mattresses, no warm blankets. The homes were often drafty, and the floors were hard. But it wasn't just the physical conditions that made sleep difficult. The mental strain of living under the constant pressure of work and survival also weighed heavily on the peasant's mind. Could they harvest enough grain to survive the winter? Would their livestock make it through the season? How would they pay the Lord's taxes? These worries often kept peasants awake at night, despite their exhaustion. It is said that many peasants slept lightly, as their lives were constantly under threat, whether from the harshness of nature or the demands of the Lord. So, the question arises, was sleep ever truly restful for the medieval peasant? How could they find peace in the midst of such hard labor and constant worry? As we think about the medieval peasant's sleep, we must also consider how this affected their overall well-being. Was the lack of proper rest a contributing factor to the shorter lifespans of peasants during this time? Was the constant physical strain coupled with restless sleep a form of silent suffering? And if sleep was so elusive for them, how did they manage to continue their grueling existence year after year? As we continue to explore the daily lives of medieval peasants, it becomes increasingly apparent that their existence was not just about labor, it was about survival. Time for them was a constant enemy. The medieval peasant's year was divided into a strict calendar of labor that revolved around the needs of the land, the seasons, and the demands of the Lord. These divisions of time were not arbitrary. They were essential for survival. The harvest had to be gathered in before the first frost. The animals had to be prepared for winter before the cold set in. There was little room for rest, and certainly no time for idle pleasure. The medieval calendar was one of near constant labor, with periods of work stretching from sunrise to sunset. In the warmer months, the hours were long. Peasant farmers might work up to 16 hours a day, taking only a short break for meals. A day's work was often not completed until the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving little time for anything other than sleep. But even sleep was not guaranteed, as many peasants were required to rise in the middle of the night to tend to livestock, maintain the fires, or check on crops that were vulnerable to pests or weather. As the days grew colder and shorter during the winter months, the pace of work slowed slightly, but the weight of responsibility never lifted. Peasants still had to tend to their animals and their homes. Firewood had to be gathered for warmth, and food had to be preserved for the coming year. But the winter months, while somewhat less physically taxing, were also marked by a different kind of pressure. With fewer daylight hours and the threat of food scarcity looming, there was little room for error. If a crop failed or a cow became ill, it could spell disaster for an entire family. During these long winter nights, sleep should have been a welcome respite, but instead, it often came with its own set of anxieties. The fear of hunger, illness, or the possibility of losing one's home was a constant undercurrent in the lives of peasants. How could one truly rest when there was always something to worry about? Whether it was a bad harvest, a harsh winter, or a dispute with the Lord, the burden of these worries was never far from a peasant's mind. Yet, despite these hardships, the peasants managed to build a strong sense of community. They relied on one another for support, whether it was helping each other harvest crops or building each other's homes. In some ways, the challenges of life in the medieval world bound peasants together. There was a shared understanding that survival required not just hard work, but cooperation. Sleep, though still elusive, often came in moments of solidarity. The communal experience of working and resting together created a sense of collective resilience. They shared both the struggles and the small triumphs, finding comfort in their connection to one another. This communal aspect of life was particularly important during the religious festivals that marked the calendar. Festivals provided rare breaks from the endless cycle of work, even if only for a short time. These occasions were times of feasting, singing, and socializing, where peasants could momentarily forget the burdens of daily life. But even during these moments of relative peace, the harsh realities of life still lingered at the edges. How could one fully enjoy a feast when the next day would bring more hard labor, more uncertainty? The role of religion in the life of the medieval peasant cannot be overlooked. Religion provided structure and meaning to their lives, offering not just spiritual solace, but a framework for understanding their existence. The church played a central role in organizing their time and providing comfort during moments of distress. The bells that rang out across the countryside signaling the hours of prayer were a reminder of both the routine and the sanctity of life. For many peasants, faith was one of the few comforts available to them. Prayer and worship offered moments of respite from the endless work and worries. But even the rituals of church were not entirely free from the burdens of the world. Services, while providing a sense of peace, were still part of the rhythm of labor and survival. The peasant's connection to God was not just a spiritual one. but also a practical one, tied to the cycles of the land and the rhythms of the harvest. Yet despite all these efforts to find peace, the life of a medieval peasant was ultimately defined by the passage of time, the seasons, the hours of the day, and the relentless march of years. With few distractions, time was often measured by work rather than by rest or recreation. When the harvest was gathered, there was a brief moment of relief, but it was always followed by the knowledge that more work awaited. The seasons did not stop, and neither did the demands of survival. As the year cycled through its stages, it became clear that the lives of peasants were not just dictated by the seasons of nature, but by the larger forces of society. The feudal system, which bound peasants to the land, left them with little control over their own destinies. The land they worked was not theirs to own, and the fruits of their labor often went to their lord. The sleep of the peasant, then, was not just interrupted by the physical toll of work, but by the knowledge that their efforts were often to benefit someone else. And as we consider the sleep of the peasant, we must ask ourselves, could the medieval peasant ever truly rest, knowing that their survival was always on the line? How could one find peace in sleep when the very essence of life was about survival, labor, and the constant struggle for the next day? The answers remain elusive, just as the sleep of the peasant did. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration into the lives of medieval peasants, we must now reflect on the deeper truths of their existence, ones that are often overlooked in favor of grander historical narratives. The lives of these men and women, bound by labor, duty, and an unyielding cycle of survival, speak volumes about human resilience. Yet, their silent suffering and endurance remain some of the most understated aspects of history. How did they manage to endure such grueling lives year after year with so little recognition or respite? What was it that kept them going, despite the ceaseless burden of their existence? At the heart of the medieval peasant's life was the overwhelming necessity of survival. Each day was a test, each year a challenge. If the harvest failed, there was no government aid or social safety net. There was no welfare or charity to lean on. The land itself, which peasants worked so tirelessly to cultivate, could betray them with droughts, floods, or pests. Yet, in the face of these challenges, the peasants continued to work, to labor, to survive. The resilience required to endure such hardships is unimaginable in the modern world, where most of us are far removed from the harshness of daily survival. But this resilience was not without its toll. The sleep of the medieval peasant, disrupted by the constant pressures of survival, reflects a broader truth about their lives. The work was physically exhausting, and the fears of hunger, illness, and loss hung over them like a dark cloud. The strain of knowing that a single bad season could spell disaster was ever present. And yet, the peasants still rose with the dawn each day, repeating the cycle without complaint. Why? What drove them? The answer lies, in part, in the deep sense of community that peasants shared. Despite their hardships, they were not alone. They had families, neighbors, and fellow workers who understood the struggles they faced. The communal nature of their lives, working together in the fields, sharing what little food they had, and providing support during times of illness or hardship, helped to sustain them. This communal support was not just practical, it was emotional and psychological. The knowledge that others shared their burdens was perhaps the most significant comfort the peasant could have. In the face of endless labor and the fear of the unknown, the bonds of community provided a sense of belonging and solidarity that helped them face another day. Yet, as much as community provided a sense of security, the individual lives of peasants were often filled with isolation. Many peasants lived on isolated farms, far from towns or villages, and communication with others was limited to brief interactions during market days or religious festivals. In these moments, they found joy and connection, but they were fleeting. For much of the time, peasants lived in near-complete isolation, their days filled with hard labor, and their nights marked by the same sense of exhaustion and uncertainty. Sleep, in this context, was more than just a physical necessity. It was an emotional and mental escape. After a day of work in the fields or tending animals, sleep was often the only time when the peasant could momentarily forget the struggles of daily life. It was a brief respite from the constant pressure to survive, from the worry of famine or plague. But even in sleep, there was little peace. The dreams of a peasant, if they had the luxury of sleep at all, were likely filled with images of the day's labor, the worries of the future, and the unrelenting demands of the land. Perhaps the most profound aspect of the medieval peasant's life was their acceptance of hardship. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, peasants found ways to make peace with the constant uncertainty of their existence. They understood that life was a cycle of labor and rest, struggle and survival. Sleep, then, was not just a physical necessity, but a mental coping mechanism. It was a brief escape from the burdens of their reality, a way to recharge for another day of work and worry. In the larger scope of history, the lives of medieval peasants may seem insignificant. They left behind no grand monuments, no powerful empires, no lasting legacies. Their contributions to society were largely invisible, overshadowed by the exploits of kings, warriors, and philosophers. But in the quiet daily rituals of survival, these peasants played a crucial role in sustaining the medieval world. Their labor fed the kingdoms, built the cities, and maintained the social order. Without them, the great civilizations of Europe would not have survived. Today, as we look back at the medieval period, we often focus on the more dramatic aspects of history, the wars, the rulers, the conquests. But the true story of the medieval world is one of quiet perseverance, of the often forgotten lives of peasants who lived in the shadows of history. Their struggles, their sacrifices, and their resilience should be remembered, not just as a footnote in the annals of history, but as a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. The sleep of the medieval peasant, then, serves as a metaphor for their entire existence. It was not a peaceful rest, but a necessary pause in the ongoing struggle for survival. And as we think about the lives of these silent heroes of history, we are reminded that sometimes it is the quiet endurance of ordinary people that makes history possible. So as you prepare for your own sleep tonight, think of the medieval peasant who faced the same natural cycle of day and night, but whose days were filled with labor and whose nights were filled with the hope for a new dawn, just as tomorrow holds the promise of a new beginning for you. Ancient Rome, with its grand buildings, military conquests, and political intrigue, often obscures the daily lives of the women who lived in this ancient civilization. While the emperors and generals took center stage in the history books, the lives of Roman women were equally vital in shaping the social fabric of Rome, though rarely documented in detail. These women, particularly the matrons, the married women of Rome, were the quiet yet essential pillars of Roman society. Their lives, their duties, and their influence in the domestic sphere shaped the very foundations of Roman civilization. The status of Roman women was complex. While they were citizens and held legal rights, their freedoms were confined within the boundaries of family and social expectations. They had no political voice and could not vote or hold public office. However, despite these limitations, Roman matrons had significant power within the home and were key players in maintaining the stability of Roman society. They were expected to manage the household, raise children, and uphold the family's honor. Yet their lives were often defined by their husbands' careers and their family's social standing. In Rome, a woman's role as a matron was one of great responsibility. She was the heart of the Roman family, the custodian of its traditions, and the keeper of its values. But beyond these expected roles, Roman matrons were also highly skilled managers of the household. They oversaw the daily operations of the home, from supervising slaves and servants to managing the family's finances. In a society where men were occupied with political and military affairs, it was the women who often ensured the smooth running of the domestic realm. Take, for instance, Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, who were pivotal figures in Roman history. Cornelia's life is often cited as an example of the ideal Roman matron. Though she wasn't involved in politics directly, her influence was profound. Cornelia was known for her wisdom, her strength of character, and her ability to maintain control over her household. She was celebrated for her role in raising her sons, who went on to challenge the Roman political system. Cornelia's legacy was not defined by grand public speeches or military victories, but by the quiet power she wielded in the private sphere. How then did a woman like Cornelia manage to leave such a lasting mark on history, even without holding any official power? For many Roman women, marriage was their primary avenue for social advancement. Marriages were often arranged by families to strengthen political or financial alliances. The matron's role in such unions was crucial, not as a political figure in the public sense, but as a figurehead within the private and familial structure. Through her marriage, a woman could either elevate her family status or, conversely, see it diminished. The power of a Roman woman, in many ways, was tied directly to her family's reputation and the legacy of her ancestors. While matrons held domestic power, they also had to adhere to the rigorous moral expectations of Roman society. The virtues of modesty, fidelity, and piety were essential to their status. Roman matrons were expected to serve as examples of moral rectitude, their actions closely scrutinized by society. A woman's honor was paramount in Roman society, and any misstep could lead to disgrace not only for her, but for her entire family. These moral expectations, while restrictive, were also a source of quiet power. A woman who upheld the virtues of Roman society was highly respected, and her influence extended far beyond her household. Yet, the constant pressure to conform to these ideals must have been exhausting. How did these women manage to balance such heavy expectations with the demands of daily life? Roman matrons often led lives that were, in some ways, defined by the unseen, by the quiet, often invisible work that kept Roman society functioning. From their role in managing households to their influence over the upbringing of children, women were integral to the success of the Roman Empire, even if they were rarely the ones who received public recognition. Their power lay not in public office or military conquest, but in the private spaces of the home, where they shaped the future of Rome, one child, one household at a time. But what was it really like to live in such a world? How did these women cope with the limitations placed upon them? How did they navigate their personal desires and ambitions within a society that valued them largely for their domestic roles? What was the reality behind the quiet, moral strength that Roman society so admired in its matrons? These questions remain largely unanswered, as the history of Roman women, particularly those of the upper classes, is often left to speculation. But one thing is certain: the role of Roman matrons, though not always acknowledged in history books, was indispensable. Without them, the very foundations of Roman society would have faltered. And as we reflect on the lives of these women, we are left to wonder how much of their influence has been lost to time, overshadowed by the more dramatic tales of military triumphs and political machinations. As we continue our exploration of Roman women, we turn our attention to a select group of women who held a unique position in Roman society: the Vestal Virgins. These women were not just ordinary matrons or wives, but sacred priestesses who served Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, in one of the most important religious roles in ancient Rome. Their lives, cloistered away from the public eye, were governed by strict rules and rituals, and yet their influence was profound, shaping the very heart of Roman spiritual and social life. The Vestal Virgins were chosen from noble families, often at a young age, and were sworn to serve the goddess for 30 years. During their service, they lived in the House of the Vestals, a prestigious residence in the Roman Forum, where they maintained the sacred fire that symbolized the heart of Rome. This fire was believed to be the source of the city's protection and prosperity, and its extinguishing was considered an omen of disaster. Thus, the Vestals had a sacred responsibility to keep the fire burning day and night, without fail. Becoming a Vestal Virgin was a great honor, yet it came with immense sacrifices. The Vestals were required to take a vow of chastity, dedicating their lives to the service of Vesta and the city of Rome. This vow was not just a religious duty, but a personal one, marking the Vestal Virgins as women who would not marry or have children. In a society that placed great emphasis on family and motherhood, the decision to remain celibate for the sake of religious duty was a significant commitment. However, despite the perceived sacrifices, the role of a Vestal Virgin was not without its rewards. They were granted privileges and respect, enjoying a level of autonomy and power that few women in ancient Rome could claim. One of the most notable aspects of their role was their public influence. Vestal Virgins were among the few women in Rome who held significant religious and social power. They were allowed to participate in religious rituals and even to give advice to Roman magistrates. This level of authority was rare for women in a society where their roles were often limited to the home. The Vestals were also the only women allowed to own property and manage their own finances, a privilege that set them apart from other women in Roman society. But despite this power, the Vestals were still constrained by the very nature of their vows. Their lives were not their own. They were bound to the service of Vesta, and their every action was governed by the demands of their sacred duties. The role of the Vestal Virgin also came with a heavy sense of duty. Their responsibility was not only to tend to the sacred fire, but to uphold the purity of Rome itself. If a Vestal was found to have violated her vow of chastity, she faced severe punishment. The most infamous punishment for breaking the vow of chastity was being buried alive. This gruesome fate was believed to be a necessary act to cleanse the impurity brought about by the Vestal's transgression. The severity of this punishment reflects the immense importance placed on the purity of the Vestals and the fear that any imperfection in their service would lead to the downfall of Rome. Despite the gravity of their duties, the daily lives of the Vestals were not marked by grand ceremonies and constant public attention. In fact, their lives were often defined by a sense of isolation and ritual. The hours of their day were carefully structured, from performing religious ceremonies to maintaining the sacred fire. to learning the ancient prayers and rituals that were passed down from one generation of Vestals to the next. They were expected to live in silence and purity, removed from the distractions and temptations of the outside world. However, this isolation did not mean that the Vestals were entirely detached from Roman society. On the contrary, their role in the religious rituals of Rome brought them into the public eye during certain festivals and ceremonies. One of the most important of these was the celebration of the Vestalia, a festival dedicated to Vesta. During this time, the Vestals were allowed to leave their residence and visit the temple of Vesta to offer sacrifices and make prayers for the well-being of the city. This public participation in the religious life of Rome allowed the Vestals to maintain a visible presence in Roman society, even as they adhered to the strict rules of their order. Yet, despite their high status, the Vestals were still women, and their roles were ultimately defined by their gender. While they had certain privileges and power, they were still bound by societal expectations. Their celibacy was not only a religious vow, but also a societal one, reinforcing the Roman view that a woman's ultimate role was to serve her family, her husband, and her city. The Vestal virgins, in their sacred service, were both exceptions and extensions of these expectations. They were revered for their purity, their discipline, and their devotion, but they were also confined by their gender and by the religious and social structures that dictated their lives. The Vestal virgins provide a fascinating lens through which to view the complexities of Roman society. Their lives, defined by both privilege and constraint, speak to the tensions inherent in a world where power and duty intersect with gender expectations. The Vestals were not only guardians of the sacred fire, but also the embodiment of Rome's moral and spiritual purity. And yet, in the quiet, almost invisible nature of their lives, they were ultimately shaped by the same forces that defined the lives of other Roman women: social expectations, religious duty, and the unrelenting demands of a society that both exalted and restricted them. But what then did it mean to be a woman in a society like Rome, where one's life was bound by religious and social codes? How did the Vestal virgins reconcile their sense of identity with their sacred duties? Were they empowered by their unique role, or did it serve only to reinforce the limitations placed upon them? These questions, too, remain largely unanswered, as the lives of the Vestals are shrouded in mystery and legend. As we draw to the close of our exploration into the lives of women in ancient Rome, it is clear that the influence of Roman matrons and Vestal virgins extended far beyond their domestic roles and religious duties. While their lives may have been marked by sacrifice, restraint, and ritual, they left behind a legacy that shaped the cultural and moral foundations of Roman society. Their lives were defined by a tension between power and constraint, freedom and duty, but they were also marked by a quiet resilience that allowed them to thrive within the rigid structures of their time. The Roman matron, whether in her role as mother, wife, or head of the household, played an essential part in the continuation of Roman society. While she may have had little political or public influence, the domestic space that she controlled was of utmost importance. The strength of a Roman family, as well as its social and economic stability, often rested in the hands of the matron. Her role in the upbringing of children, particularly in shaping their moral and social values, was a foundational aspect of Roman culture. This responsibility was not just limited to the physical realm of running the household, but extended to the spiritual and moral guidance of the family. Through her actions, the matron ensured that the values of Roman society, fidelity, piety, and honor, were passed down to the next generation. It is perhaps in their ability to endure the limitations imposed upon them that Roman women exhibited the most significant power. Despite their lack of public recognition, the lives of Roman women were central to the fabric of Roman civilization. In their daily tasks, they ensured the smooth operation of Roman society, kept the family unit intact, and upheld the moral values that were critical to Rome's success. The silent strength of Roman matrons, who quietly upheld the traditions and structures of their society, is a testament to the resilience of women throughout history. They may have been left out of the grand historical narratives, but their influence was ever present. The Vestal Virgins, on the other hand, represented a different, more sacred kind of power. They were at once revered and restricted, their lives governed by sacred vows and societal expectations. Yet, despite the challenges they faced, the Vestals held an exalted position in Roman society. They were among the few women who could wield real power, managing their own finances, offering counsel to Roman magistrates, and commanding respect for their devotion to the city's welfare. Their celibacy, though restrictive, gave them a unique status that few women of Rome could claim. In a world dominated by male public figures, the Vestals were women who could influence the course of Roman history, if only from the shadows. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Vestal Virgins' lives is the paradox they embodied. They were the custodians of Rome's most sacred fire, and through this role, they played an integral part in the spiritual health of the city. And yet, for all their religious importance, the Vestals were bound by a set of rules that left them with little personal freedom. They were not to marry, have children, or even pursue personal ambitions outside the service of the goddess Vesta. Their lives were defined by service to others, first and foremost to the city of Rome, and secondarily to the goddess they worshipped. This juxtaposition of power and restriction made the Vestal Virgins one of the most intriguing and enigmatic groups of women in history. In their quiet service, the Vestals embodied the spirit of Rome itself, both an empire of grand conquests and an enduring commitment to maintaining the sacred order. Their commitment to their vows was an embodiment of the Roman virtue of pietas, a devotion to duty and reverence for the gods and the state. They did not seek fame or recognition, but through their dedication, they became symbols of Rome's spiritual health and moral fortitude. Yet, the story of Roman women, both matrons and Vestals, is ultimately a story of resilience. It is the story of women who, though often invisible in the larger narratives of history, played critical roles in sustaining and shaping the Roman Empire. The legacy they left behind is not one of grand political achievements or military victories, but one of quiet endurance and a devotion to the preservation of the family, society, and the state. They were, in many ways, the unsung heroines of Roman history, whose actions and sacrifices ensured the survival of a civilization that would endure for centuries. As we reflect on the lives of these women, we are left to consider the lasting impact of their roles. What would Rome have been without the strength of its women? Could it have survived without the vigilance of the Vestals, keeping the sacred flame alight, or without the steady hand of the matron, guiding the next generation? In a world that often erased the contributions of women, the quiet power of the Roman matron and the Vestal Virgin remains one of the most enduring legacies of ancient Rome. And so, as we close the chapter on the unseen women of Rome, we are reminded that the lives of those who lived in the shadows of history are often the most profound. It is in the quiet, often unnoticed actions of women like the Roman matron and the Vestal Virgin that we find the true strength of a society. And as we look back on their lives, we must ask ourselves, how much of history's story has been shaped by those who remained unseen? How many women like the Roman matrons and vestals, have quietly built the foundations of the civilizations that came before us. Zeus, the king of the gods, was not only the god of thunder and lightning, but also the overseer of all that occurred in the heavens and earth. The weight of his divine duties, however, was often invisible to those who marveled at his grandeur. His reign over Mount Olympus required constant vigilance, and sleep seemed an elusive luxury. In ancient Greece, gods were thought to embody not just the forces of nature, but the eternal rhythms of the universe itself. But even the mighty Zeus, who controlled the very skies, found himself weary, for the demands of ruling were not only physical, but deeply mental. For centuries, Zeus had governed the lives of mortals and immortals alike. His decisions impacted everything from the rise and fall of cities to the lives of the most trivial creatures. Yet, despite his vast influence, he often found himself awake through the night, contemplating matters that could not easily be solved by simple divine intervention. How could he decide the fate of entire civilizations without risking imbalance? The gods, unlike mortals, did not need sleep in the same way, but they still longed for moments of respite. The nights on Olympus were a paradox, an unsettling stillness that weighed heavily on Zeus's shoulders. His thoughts often turned to the injustices that plagued the world, the endless disputes between gods, and the constant pressure to maintain harmony. Though he could command thunder to strike or storms to break, Zeus himself was powerless against the relentless need for judgment and balance. And so, when the moonlight bathed the great hall of Olympus, Zeus remained awake, turning over decisions in his mind, never allowing himself to truly rest. Zeus's sleepless nights were not only a reflection of his responsibility, but also of his fear. A fear that if he closed his eyes, even for a moment, something important would slip through his grasp. Perhaps the world would descend into chaos, or another god would rise to challenge his authority. It was a cycle of vigilance, a weight that other gods did not fully understand. While other deities had their own concerns and troubles, none had the same level of universal responsibility as Zeus. One fateful night, when the gods gathered in Olympus to celebrate a rare moment of peace, Zeus was unusually quiet. His mind was not on the revelry, but on a distant event. A mortal king in the farthest reaches of Greece was about to make a decision that could change the fate of an entire region. The mortals did not realize the far-reaching consequences of their actions, and Zeus knew this. The mortal world was a delicate web, and he held the strands in his hands. As he pondered the decision, the question arose: could the mortal king's fate be altered without tipping the balance? Could Zeus intervene? Was he merely a bystander in the lives of mortals, or was he destined to shape every turn of their story? Would Zeus, the mighty ruler, continue to bear the burden of endless responsibility, or would he find a way to escape this cycle of sleepless vigilance? Could he ever find peace, even for a moment? The uncertainty of his situation left him restless, and the weight of his godly duties remained unbearable. And so, Zeus sat alone in the quiet of Olympus, as the stars above twinkled endlessly in the night sky. Was it possible for him to release his grip on the fate of the world, even for a night? Zeus's unease grew as the hour stretched on. He walked the halls of Olympus, his mind lost in a labyrinth of thoughts. His gaze occasionally flickered to the distant horizon, where the mortal world lay beneath his watchful eye. The night was still, the stars twinkling in the deep heavens, but even the serenity of the celestial body failed to calm him. What lay ahead for both gods and mortals? Would the mortal king, who had been unknowingly influenced by the whims of divine forces, make a choice that could bring about ruin? It was not the first time Zeus had faced this dilemma. His decisions, made over centuries, had shaped civilizations, some flourishing, others falling into ruin. He had often wondered if his own actions had gone too far in some instances, for sometimes his interventions in mortal affairs had unintended consequences. He had seen great kingdoms rise and fall on the back of one decision, a single strike of lightning, or a whisper to one of his lesser gods. The power he wielded was undeniable, but the burden of choice weighed on him endlessly. Even in his moments of weakness, Zeus found himself torn between the divine nature of his role and his deep empathy for mortals. He often found himself asking, "Can I really control the fates of mortals as if they were pieces on a chessboard?" He had the ability to shape events, to guide the hands of destiny, but the more he intervened, the more he became aware of the subtle complexities that were hidden beneath the surface of every decision. Was he doing this for the greater good, or was it simply his own need for control that drove him to intervene? The ancient stories told of a time when Zeus had battled with his own father, Cronus, for control of the heavens and earth. That victory had been a defining moment in his reign. Yet even now, years after defeating the Titans, Zeus was still haunted by the memories of his own father's tyranny. The gods had seen the consequences of absolute power. Was he now repeating those same mistakes by not allowing mortals the free will to carve out their own paths? As Zeus walked among his fellow gods, he couldn't help but notice their carefree attitudes. Hera, his wife, was enjoying the revelry. Apollo strummed his lyre, filling the hall with melodies that seemed to lift the heavy air. Athena, always wise and observant, watched the others with a calm demeanor. None of them seemed to share the same restless energy that Zeus felt. They had their domains to manage, but they weren't burdened by the same all-encompassing responsibility. But even in this quiet gathering, Zeus felt a gnawing emptiness. How could he find peace when the weight of every mortal life, every divine struggle, rested on his shoulders? It was during one of these quiet moments that a thought entered his mind. What if I let go? What if for once he didn't intervene? What would the world look like if Zeus allowed the natural order to unfold without his interference? This thought, though fleeting, sent a ripple through his heart. Could he allow chaos to reign, or was it his duty to uphold order, no matter the cost? In the ancient world, order was what made the gods and their lives meaningful. Without it, everything would be a mess, an endless, unpredictable storm. Yet there was a part of Zeus that longed for the very chaos he was meant to control. The more he thought, the more the dilemma became complex. Mortals, with all their flaws and unpredictability, lived lives that were fragile and fleeting. Did he have the right to control their destinies, or was he stifling their growth by constantly guiding them? As the night wore on, Zeus retreated to his throne, gazing out over the heavens. His restless mind still struggled with the mortal king's fate. But now, in the quiet of the night, a question lingered in his mind. What would happen if I allowed them to choose their own path without divine influence? This thought both comforted and frightened him. For the first time in a long while, Zeus felt the immense weight of his decisions, too great for even him to bear. Could the world be more at peace if he simply let go? Or was that a dangerous path? Could a god as powerful as Zeus truly relinquish control over the fate of all things? As dawn approached, casting a faint glow over Olympus. Zeus stood alone in the vast hall, his thoughts tangled in a web of doubt and fear. The weight of leadership, the responsibility of choice, and the temptation of letting go all battled within him. As dawn's first light broke over the distant horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Zeus stood on the precipice of a choice. The weight of centuries, of gods and mortals alike, pressed against his chest. His mind had been spinning, caught in a whirlpool of doubt, responsibility, and fear. The quiet of the early morning, rarely felt on Olympus, gave him a brief moment to reflect. For once, it was not the demands of ruling or the needs of others that filled his thoughts, but the question of what it meant to truly let go. Zeus had spent eons wrestling with the consequences of his decisions. He had watched mortals live and die, kingdoms rise and fall, and cities grow into empires only to collapse. The gods, with all their grandeur and power, were not immune to the passage of time. They, too, felt the sting of uncertainty, of conflict, and of loss. But for Zeus, the most difficult thing was knowing that his every decision reverberated throughout the world, affecting not just the lives of mortals, but the very fabric of existence itself. For so long, Zeus had believed that in order to be a good ruler, a good god, he had to hold the reins tightly. Control was paramount. He had learned that long ago in his battle against his father, Cronus. That was the moment when Zeus had claimed his power, defeating the Titans and becoming the ruler of the gods. Yet now, as he stood alone in the stillness of the morning, the reality of that control began to feel more like a curse than a blessing. Perhaps, for the first time, Zeus understood the true cost of leadership, the cost of being the one who always had to make the hard choices. He had created a world in which everything, even the smallest detail, was controlled by the gods. In his attempts to maintain order and balance, he had inadvertently stifled the growth of those he sought to protect. Could mortals, and even the gods, be truly free if their destinies were always shaped by his will? A deep, unsettling thought began to grow in Zeus's mind. What would happen if I let the mortal king make his decision without interference? As much as it terrified him, the idea was liberating. To allow the world to unfold without his constant intervention, to step back and watch the drama of existence play out on its own. Perhaps the gods had been wrong all along. Perhaps their role was not to control, but to guide when needed and to step aside when the time was right. With the sun rising higher, Zeus made his decision. The mortal king would face his fate alone. The choice would be made without divine influence, without the weight of Zeus's omnipotent hand. He would allow the course of history to unfold naturally. But as Zeus stood there, staring out into the vast unknown, he realized that even in letting go, he was still controlling the situation. He had made the choice to step back, and that decision, too, would shape the future. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that balance could never be achieved through complete detachment or complete control. The gods were not meant to rule everything. Their role was to ensure that the balance of order and chaos was maintained. But sometimes, that meant allowing the chaos to take its course. For Zeus, this was the moment of true release, not just from the responsibility of direct intervention, but from the fear of what might happen if he allowed others to shape their own futures. The heavens were still, the world below was waiting, and Zeus stood in quiet contemplation, reflecting on the cost of control. As his gaze shifted to the horizon once more, a final thought echoed in his mind. Perhaps, in letting go, I have found the true strength of a ruler. Reflection. Zeus's struggle with sleeplessness, with the constant burden of ruling, mirrors the internal conflict many face in positions of power. The weight of leadership can often be suffocating, and even the mightiest of gods can be burdened by the fear of failure or the consequences of their choices. Yet, in this story, we see that true strength does not always come from control. It can come from knowing when to step back, when to allow the world to unfold as it will. Zeus may have been the ruler of the gods, but in his final decision, he showed the wisdom of knowing when to trust the world around him, a lesson that transcends even the divine. Would the mortal world have unraveled without Zeus' intervention? Or would it have found its own path, as all things inevitably do? The answer remains a mystery, but the lesson is clear. Control is a double-edged sword, and true power lies in understanding when to relinquish it. And so, the gods of Olympus, though eternal, are not exempt from the weariness that comes with the burdens of power. The story of Zeus reminds us that sometimes the greatest strength lies in embracing the unknown and stepping back when the weight of the world feels too heavy to bear. Apollo, the god of the sun, was known for his radiant beauty, his brilliance, and his endless journey across the sky each day. He was a symbol of light and order, bringing day to the world, as he rode his golden chariot through the heavens. But behind the myth of Apollo's divine brilliance lay an underlying struggle, an exhaustion that even the sun god himself could not escape. Every morning, Apollo would rise from his palace in the east, his horses ready to carry him across the sky, bringing the light of day to the earth below. It was a task he performed with unwavering consistency, for the world could not function without the sun. Mortals depended on his light to grow their crops, to guide their daily lives, and to mark the passing of time. And yet, Apollo's duties were not as fulfilling as they might have seemed. For as much as Apollo illuminated the world, he himself was enveloped in a never-ending cycle. From dawn to dusk, he drove his chariot tirelessly across the heavens. His days were predictable, repetitive, and draining. Despite his divine nature, there was a weariness that Apollo could not escape. The constant pursuit of the horizon, always just out of reach, left him feeling empty, as though he were chasing something he could never grasp. Unlike the other gods, who had their moments of rest and revelry, Apollo had no such luxury. He was the harbinger of daylight, and thus he could not rest until his task was complete. Even as the day wore on and the evening approached, the sun god's fatigue grew. The golden chariot, though magnificent, felt heavy with the weight of responsibility. Yet Apollo never faltered. He could not. The world relied on him. As he traveled across the sky, his thoughts wandered. He had often wondered if his endless chase was a metaphor for his own life. Each day, he rose to meet the sun, and each night, he was forced to rest, only to rise again the following morning. But where was the meaning in this? Was he truly the master of his destiny, or was he simply trapped in an eternal cycle of obligation? The other gods sometimes mocked Apollo's diligence, calling him the sun chaser, as if his work was too simple. But Apollo knew that they did not understand. His work was not just about bringing light to the world. It was about maintaining balance. Without his efforts, chaos would reign. The earth would fall into darkness, and the seasons would be thrown into disarray. And yet, in the quiet moments between his daily task, Apollo felt the weight of his isolation. While the gods of Olympus celebrated in their halls, Apollo was alone in the vast sky, with only the winds as his companions. He had no one to share the burden of his endless journey. The sun was his responsibility, and no one else could take his place. As the sun sank lower on the horizon, Apollo felt the familiar tug of exhaustion pulling at him. The horizon, always just out of reach, mocked him with its promise of rest. Yet, even as the day drew to a close, he knew that his work was far from over. The world depended on him, and that knowledge kept him going. But deep inside, Apollo began to wonder, what if I could rest? What would happen if I let the sun sink below the horizon, never to rise again? Would the world fall apart without me? As Apollo's chariot continued its inexorable march across the heavens, the golden light that bathed the world began to dim, though Apollo was still far from his final destination. The fatigue, once an invisible undercurrent to his daily journey, had begun to manifest more clearly. His usually steady grip on the reins wavered slightly, and his horses, the fiery steeds Pyrrha and Erymanthos, seemed to feel it too. They had been running tirelessly, day after day, for as long as Apollo could remember. For most gods, there were moments of relief, gatherings in the halls of Olympus, feasts and music, periods of peace that allowed them to recover. But for Apollo, there was no respite, no reprieve from the relentless routine. His very existence was tied to the rise and fall of the sun, a duty handed down to him by his father Zeus, and one that he could not escape. Yet, for the first time in his eternal life, Apollo began to question his role. What if I refused to rise tomorrow? He wondered, though the thought seemed absurd. Could he, the god of the sun, really allow darkness to reign? Could he leave the world in chaos? The mere thought was terrifying. The consequences of such an act were unknown, and Apollo knew that nothing, not even his godly powers, could foresee the repercussions. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, a cool wind blew across the sky, carrying with it a scent that reminded Apollo of the earth below, of the mortal world he so rarely saw. The familiar landscape of the heavens began to blur as exhaustion swept over him in waves. He thought of the countless mortals who depended on him for the light, the growth of crops, the marking of time. He had never truly stopped to consider the weight of their reliance on him. Every harvest, every birth, every change of season was tied to his presence in the sky. He had been a constant, but now his own need for a break had grown too great to ignore. Apollo had always prided himself on his strength, on his ability to bear the weight of his responsibilities without complaint. But the repetition had begun to erode his spirit. The once invigorating task of bringing daylight to the earth had become a monotonous, endless cycle. Even as he turned his chariot westward, there was a deep, gnawing longing to leave it all behind, to retreat to the quiet solace of the heavens and rest. And yet, the knowledge that he could not abandon his post, no matter how weary he became, gnawed at him. The gods had entrusted him with this duty, and to relinquish it would be to defy their will, the will of Zeus himself. Apollo knew that no matter how tired he grew, no matter how much he desired a break, he could not rest. He was the sun. Without him, everything would fall apart. Still, a voice deep within him persisted, urging him to break free. Could he really be more than his role? Could he exist without the constant need to shine? Apollo had heard whispers in the halls of Olympus from the other gods. Some believed his eternal chase was a burden, while others mocked him for his unyielding commitment. Even his twin sister Artemis had often spoken of the freedom she felt in her hunts, unbound by the rigid structure of daily duties. Apollo envied her in those moments, but he knew that his path was different. As the chariot neared its descent, and the colors of the sky shifted to hues of purple and orange. Apollo could no longer ignore the question that had been plaguing his mind. What if I let go? In that fleeting moment, Apollo entertained the idea of stopping the chariot, of allowing the sun to rest. What would the world be like in the absence of his light? Would the gods, in their vast wisdom, step in and restore the balance? Or would everything, mortal and immortal alike, descend into chaos? As the horizon drew closer, Apollo's uncertainty reached its peak. Could he truly be more than the sum of his duties? Would he always be defined by his role in the heavens? Or could he, just for once, be something else entirely? These questions hung in the air like the fading light, unresolved, as Apollo felt the pull of the night nearing. With a final glance over the world below, Apollo steeled himself for the end of another day. He would continue his chase, as he had for countless eons. But deep down, the question remained unanswered. Could a god ever be free of the expectations placed upon him? As Apollo's chariot touched the horizon, the final rays of sunlight bled into the twilight, marking the close of another day. The skies darkened, and the world below transitioned from the warmth of daylight to the cool embrace of night. Apollo, though exhausted beyond measure, could not help but feel the familiar tug of duty. His work was not over yet. Night had fallen, but tomorrow the cycle would begin again. Despite the endless repetition, Apollo's mind raced with the questions that had haunted him during the descent. What would happen if I let go? The idea of releasing the reins, of stopping his eternal chase, seemed almost liberating. The very thought terrified him, yet it also stirred something deep within. He had always been bound by his duty, but for the first time, Apollo wondered if there might be another way. The stars began to twinkle above him, their quiet glow a stark contrast to his burning light. In that moment, Apollo realized something profound. Perhaps he was not simply the sun. Perhaps he was also the embodiment of time itself. And time, as he had come to understand, was not something that could be controlled or bent to one's will. It was something to be accepted, as it was, in all its constant movement. For a moment, Apollo's gaze lingered on the stars above, each one distant and untouchable, and yet they persisted in their quiet, eternal existence. The stars did not chase the horizon, nor did they race across the heavens in endless pursuit. They merely shone, content in their place. Apollo wondered if, perhaps, there was something he could learn from their stillness. As the night deepened, Apollo's horses slowed, and the chariot rested on the far edge of the sky, waiting to rise again at dawn. The moon, that quiet companion of the night, rose in its place, casting a soft glow across the world. Apollo's sister Artemis was now in control, guiding the moon across the heavens as he had once done with the sun. There was a certain peace in the transition, a delicate balance between the two siblings that spoke to a greater harmony in the cosmos. Apollo, for the first time in his existence, allowed himself to close his eyes. The vast expanse of the heavens, which had always felt like an endless road, now seemed infinite and serene. The constant pressure to shine, to chase, to fulfill his duty, had loosened its grip on him, even if only for a brief moment. He could finally rest. But even in the stillness, Apollo's mind remained active. He reflected on the importance of his work. The world needed him, as it needed the sun. But perhaps the most important lesson was one of balance. He could not burn forever, and neither could the world rely solely on his light. Just as the night followed the day, Apollo understood that rest was as much a part of the cycle as the work itself. In the quiet of the night, Apollo began to understand that his eternal chase did not define him. It was his purpose, yes, but it was not the sum of his existence. He was the god of light, but he was also a god of wisdom, of music, of prophecy, and of healing. The pursuit of his role as the sun god was not an endless race. He could pause, reflect, and return with renewed strength. The world would continue without him for a time, but the balance would always remain. Apollo's mind quieted as he drifted into a rare, peaceful slumber, knowing that tomorrow would rise again. But now there was a sense of peace within him. The sun would rise, but it would not be a chase. It would be a journey, and that journey, like the cycle of life itself, would always come full circle. As the night unfolded, Apollo let go of the fear that had gripped him for so long. The sun would set again, and it would rise once more, just as it always had. But in that moment of rest, he realized that perhaps, in allowing himself to rest, he had found a new understanding of what it meant to be truly free. Reflection. Apollo's struggle mirrors the experiences of many who carry heavy burdens, the fear of letting go, of stepping back from their responsibilities, and of allowing the world to continue without them. However, in embracing rest, Apollo discovered an essential truth. True power does not lie in endless pursuit, but in the wisdom to balance work with rest, action with reflection. The sun would rise again, and Apollo would be there to meet it, but now with a renewed understanding of his place in the cosmos. In the quiet stillness of the night, Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, sat alone in her temple on Mount Olympus. While the gods of Olympus reveled in their immortal pleasures, Athena found solace in solitude. Her keen mind, ever observant and always analyzing, was a constant presence in her life. Unlike other gods who were often content with their divine roles, Athena found herself in perpetual contemplation, pondering the endless complexities of the world, both mortal and divine. Her wisdom was unmatched, and her intellect surpassed that of all the gods. Yet, with this gift came a burden, an unending quest for understanding that sometimes led to sleepless nights. While others rested, letting their minds wander freely, Athena's thoughts were never at ease. There was always something more to learn, a new strategy to devise, or a puzzle to solve. Her mind was a vast labyrinth, filled with ideas, theories, and plans that never seemed to find resolution. The night, however, provided a rare kind of peace. As the world below her slept, Athena would often find herself gazing at the stars, lost in thought. The heavens, with their vastness and mystery, had always fascinated her. They were the ultimate symbol of order and chaos, and Athena, ever the strategist, sought to understand both. She knew that the balance of the cosmos was fragile, a delicate dance between opposing forces. The gods themselves were part of this balance, and Athena's role was to ensure that the scales never tipped too far in favor of one side or the other. But even with her vast knowledge, Athena was often plagued by questions she could not answer. The nature of the gods, their motivations, and their true purpose in the world. These were matters that she pondered often. She was a goddess of logic, but there were aspects of existence that defied reason, that could not be explained by even the most brilliant minds. As the night wore on, Athena's mind turned to the mortal world below. She had watched over Greece for centuries, guiding its heroes and shaping its cities with her wisdom. But despite her influence, she often wondered whether mortals truly understood the lessons she sought to teach them. They were so caught up in their ambitions, their wars, and their fleeting desires, and yet they seemed to miss the greater truths of existence. The irony was not lost on Athena. She, a goddess of wisdom, was often more distant from the world she cared for than the mortals she sought to guide. Yet even in her isolation, Athena knew that her role was crucial. Mortals, despite their flaws, needed guidance. The heroes she had mentored, the cities she had helped shape, these were her contributions to the world. But would they be enough? Would her wisdom, passed down through the ages, continue to have an impact? Or would it fade into obscurity, lost to time as so many other things had? Athena's gaze drifted to the moon, its soft light casting shadows across her temple. The moon, like the stars, was a symbol of something greater, of the eternal cycle of time, of the rhythms that govern the universe. In many ways, Athena was like the moon. She, too, was constant, a presence that never wavered, always watching, always learning. Yet, even the moon had its phases. It, too, had moments of darkness, of obscurity, where its light was hidden from the world. Athena wondered if there would ever be a time when her wisdom would fade, when her light would be eclipsed by the passage of time. As the night deepened, Athena's thoughts turned inward. She had always been a solitary figure, finding peace in her own company, in the quiet of her mind. But there were moments, rare moments, when she longed for something more. Could she, too, find rest from the constant cycle of contemplation? Could she release herself from the endless pursuit of knowledge, if only for a brief moment? It was a thought that unsettled her. To cease thinking, to allow her mind to drift without purpose. Was that a luxury she could afford? Or was it a dangerous path, one that could lead to complacency? Athena, ever the strategist, knew that rest could not be taken lightly. It was a necessary part of the cycle of life. But for someone like her, whose mind was always in motion, it seemed like a foreign concept. And yet, as the stars twinkled above her, Athena couldn't help but wonder, what if I let go, just for a night? As the moon climbed higher into the sky, Athena's thoughts wandered deeper into realms where logic and reason could not fully reach. The goddess of wisdom had always prided herself on her clarity of mind, but tonight, the labyrinth of her thoughts seemed endless and increasingly tangled. She had spent countless hours studying the world, devising plans, and analyzing the actions of mortals and gods alike. But now, for the first time in ages, Athena was confronted with something she could not fully comprehend, the concept of rest itself. The idea of ceasing her constant vigilance unsettled her. The gods, as immortal beings, did not need sleep in the same way mortals did. But rest was a different matter entirely. The absence of thought, the letting go of strategy, of calculations, was an idea foreign to Athena. Could she, the embodiment of wisdom and reason, truly find solace in such surrender? Athena sat motionless, her golden eyes reflecting the moonlight as she considered the deeper question. Was it weakness to rest? She had often taught others, especially her mortal heroes, that a well-timed pause could be as powerful as action itself. But those teachings had always been about strategy and war, about taking a breath before the next battle. Never before had she considered the need to rest from the ceaseless pursuit of knowledge, the endless search for truth. Her mind raced as she thought of the great figures in Greek history whom she had influenced, heroes like Odysseus, Perseus, and Heracles. They had relied on their cunning and strength to accomplish great feats, and Athena had been there every step of the way, guiding them, offering counsel, and sometimes even intervening directly. But as she reflected on their journeys, Athena realized that even the greatest of heroes had their moments of vulnerability. In order to succeed, they needed to rest, to reflect on their decisions, and to allow their minds to heal from the stresses of their tasks. Was it possible that her own endless pursuit of wisdom had become a burden, a weight too heavy for even the goddess of strategy to carry? The paradox began to dawn on her. Athena had spent her life in pursuit of perfection, of understanding, yet she had never allowed herself to fully embrace the imperfections of existence, the moments of uncertainty, of ignorance, and, yes, even of rest. Mortals in their fleeting lives were forced to experience these moments, whether they wished to or not. But for Athena, to rest meant to acknowledge that there was something beyond her control, something that she could not strategize or plan for. Her mind drifted to the world of mortals, where the lives of men and women were filled with moments of both brilliance and failure. Mortals were not bound by the unending pursuit of knowledge, as she was. They were driven by immediate needs, by the demands of survival and daily life. Athena often envied their simplicity, their ability to focus on the present rather than the far-reaching consequences of every action. But perhaps there was something to be learned from their way of life. The gods, in their wisdom, often thought themselves above such concerns. Yet, as Athena sat in her silent temple, a thought began to take root. Could the pursuit of wisdom, of knowledge, be an endless task? Or was it the acceptance of one's limitations, the ability to rest, that allowed true understanding to flourish? This question, simple yet profound, echoed through her mind. Athena had never allowed herself the luxury of not knowing. Every unanswered question, every mystery was a challenge she felt compelled to solve. But now, in the quiet of the night, she wondered if there was wisdom in accepting the limits of her own understanding. Was it possible that by stepping back, by allowing herself to be still, she could find a deeper truth? The silence of the night seemed to stretch out around her, and for the first time, Athena felt the weight of her own thoughts. The endless pursuit of knowledge had defined her existence, but perhaps it was time to reconsider her approach. Was it possible that wisdom did not come from knowing everything, but from understanding that some things were beyond comprehension? And yet, even as the thought settled in her mind, Athena's inherent nature fought against it. To rest, to step back, felt like a betrayal of her divine role. She had always been the protector of heroes, the one who guided them with reason and clarity. But could she truly continue in that role if she allowed herself to rest from the pursuit of knowledge? Could she guide others with the same authority if she, herself, was uncertain of her place in the vastness of the cosmos? The question lingered in the air like a cloud, heavy and unresolved. Athena, the goddess who had never wavered, who had always been the voice of reason and strategy, now found herself at a crossroads. The night stretched on, its silence growing deeper as the moon reached its zenith in the sky. Athena sat alone in her temple, her thoughts now swirling with a mixture of acceptance and uncertainty. The restlessness she had felt earlier had slowly ebbed away, replaced by a quiet realization. For the first time in her existence, the goddess of wisdom was confronting the truth that perhaps the greatest wisdom was not in knowing, but in acknowledging that some things could not be understood. Some moments simply had to be allowed to exist as they were. In all her years, Athena had never experienced such a profound stillness. Her mind, once a constant flurry of strategy and analysis, had quieted. The universe around her seemed to pause, as if the stars themselves were waiting for her to come to terms with the answer that she had been searching for all along. The realization was subtle at first, like the softest of whispers, but it soon became clear. Wisdom did not lie in the absence of doubt. It lay in the ability to coexist with it. Athena, in her relentless pursuit of perfection and knowledge, had never allowed herself to embrace this uncertainty. She had always been the one who could guide, who could see the path forward. But in doing so, she had denied herself the very thing she sought to give others, peace. For a moment, Athena allowed herself to simply be. She closed her eyes, letting the stillness of the night wash over her. The world did not require her to solve every problem, to answer every question, to provide clarity in every situation. The silence, the very absence of action, was a form of wisdom in itself. The gods had always prided themselves on their power and their ability to shape the world. But what if the true strength of a god lay not in controlling everything, but in understanding when to release that control? Athena had often been a figure of authority, guiding both gods and mortals with her intellect. But now, in this quiet moment, she realized that wisdom was not just about knowing what to do. It was also about knowing when to step back and allow things to unfold naturally. Perhaps that was the ultimate test of a strategist, to know that, at times, the best course of action was inaction. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, Athena's thoughts turned to the mortals she had watched over. She had helped shape the greatest of heroes, guiding them through battles and decisions. But she had also seen their struggles, their moments of failure, their doubts, and their questions. Perhaps, in guiding them, she had failed to see the value of those very doubts. Mortals, in their imperfection, were closer to the essence of true wisdom than she had ever realized. They did not have the luxury of endless contemplation. They acted, they stumbled, and they learned. And in that learning, they grew. Athena understood now that wisdom was not just about making the right decisions. It was also about embracing the journey with all its uncertainties. She had always tried to control the outcome, to ensure that everything went according to plan. But life, like the stars above, was unpredictable. There were forces beyond her comprehension, forces that could not be planned for or strategized. And in that realization, Athena found peace. She stood from her seat, her golden eyes now clear and focused. The moon had set, and the sun was beginning its ascent. Apollo's chariot would soon begin its daily journey across the sky. Athena knew that her own role in the cosmos had not changed. She would continue to guide and protect, to offer her wisdom to those who sought it. But she also understood that there would be moments when she, too, would have to step back and let the world unfold as it would. Her wisdom was not only in what she knew, but in what she allowed others to learn for themselves. And so, as the first rays of sunlight broke over Olympus, Athena felt a deep sense of calm. The world would continue, as it always had, and she would continue her work. But now, she would carry with her a new understanding, a recognition that sometimes silence and rest were just as important as wisdom itself. Reflection. Athena's journey of self-reflection and acceptance highlights an essential truth. Wisdom is not just about knowledge or strategy. It's also about embracing uncertainty and knowing when to let go. The constant pursuit of answers, of control, can blind us to the deeper truths that lie in stillness and silence. In this story, Athena learns that true wisdom lies in understanding that we are not always in control and that sometimes the best path forward is the one left unexplored. Hermes, the fleet-footed messenger of the gods, was known for his speed, cunning, and endless energy. He was the god of communication, travelers, thieves, and merchants, among other things. Yet, despite his unparalleled ability to move between realms, swift as a breeze and invisible when needed, Hermes was often troubled by an inner restlessness that he could never quite shake. It was not the physical demands of his role that drained him. Hermes could traverse the heavens, earth, and the underworld in the blink of an eye, delivering messages from the gods, running errands, and even guiding the souls of the dead. But it was the unceasing motion, the endless barrage of tasks that wore on him. He never stopped moving, never stopped working. And despite his reputation for being quick-witted and resourceful, Hermes, too, felt the weight of an existence that was constantly in motion, never still. Hermes was a god of transitions. He moved between worlds, between life and death, between the mortal and immortal realms. In his work, he was both the conduit and the boundary. He was the god who linked the gods to the mortals, who carried the wishes of Zeus and the words of the gods to distant lands. But in doing so, he found himself caught between worlds, never truly belonging to any one place. He was the god of messages, of travel, of movement. But what, he often wondered, was the message for him? As the evening sun began to dip below the horizon, Hermes found himself standing alone in his quiet temple on Mount Olympus. The laughter and music of the gods echoed faintly in the distance, but Hermes, ever the loner, preferred the silence. His mind was always racing, always planning, always thinking ahead to the next task. His thoughts were as quick and restless as his feet, and even now, as the gods celebrated, he found himself uneasy. For all his speed and agility, Hermes longed for something that he could not quite name. In his work, he was constantly in demand, never allowed to rest. Even when the gods took their moments of respite, Hermes was always needed, whether to deliver a message, escort a soul, or simply keep things in motion. He was, by nature, a god of action, but the unrelenting pace left him exhausted in ways that even the longest nap on Mount Olympus could not cure. The gods did not understand Hermes' restlessness. To them, he was a force of nature, a being of infinite motion. To stop moving would be to stop being. But Hermes wondered, for the first time, if there was a way to exist without the constant rush. Could he slow down? Could he find peace in stillness, even if only for a moment? As he sat in the quiet of his temple, the wind rustling through the trees outside, Hermes began to contemplate the true nature of his role. He was a messenger, a carrier of words and wishes, but what about his own voice? What about his own desires? He had always been the one who delivered messages, but had he ever received one for himself? Was there a message from the gods that he, too, had overlooked in his ceaseless rush to fulfill their demands? In that stillness, Hermes' mind raced with a new question. What would it mean for a god of motion to be still? Hermes sat in his temple, his gaze drifting toward the stars that were beginning to twinkle in the evening sky. The air was cool, the world around him quiet, but his thoughts were a whirlwind. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he allowed himself to stop, to simply be still. The constant motion that defined his existence was always with him. Yet now, in this rare moment of silence, Hermes felt the weight of his own need for rest. It was a strange sensation. The stillness, though peaceful, felt almost foreign to him. For so long, he had been defined by his endless energy, by his ability to run errands for the gods, to guide souls, to carry messages. His wings, those mighty sandals that allowed him to move faster than the wind, had always been his source of pride. To slow down, to take a break, seemed almost like a betrayal of his very nature. But now, as the evening deepened and the silence stretched on, Hermes wondered if there was something he was missing. The gods, as immortal beings, did not need sleep in the same way mortals did. They did not experience the exhaustion that came from the mundane realities of daily life. But even immortals needed moments of pause, of reflection. Even they, in their divine roles, carried burdens that required time for consideration. Hermes had always been a messenger, a go-between for the gods and mortals. But now, he began to ask himself, what about my own message? What about my own needs? He thought of his many tasks, delivering Zeus's commands to distant lands, guiding the souls of the dead through the underworld, and even helping mortals with their journeys. His work was endless, and the gods seemed to demand more of him with each passing day. But Hermes had begun to realize something. His role as the messenger had become a prison. He was always on the move, never allowed the luxury of pause. And yet, in this quiet hour, as the stars shimmered above him, Hermes wondered what he would find if he allowed himself to simply rest. The wind outside stirred, as though urging him to make a decision. Hermes could feel the tension in the air, the pressure to keep moving, to fulfill his duties. But something inside him was shifting. Perhaps, he thought, there was wisdom in the stillness, in stepping away from the constant whirlwind of his tasks. Perhaps, for once, he could listen to his own heart instead of the endless demands of the gods. Hermes closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, letting the quiet wash over him. He felt the stillness settling deep within him, and for the first time, it wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, there was something oddly soothing about it. He had spent so long rushing from one task to the next that he had never truly understood what it meant to be at peace. And yet, here he was, feeling a sense of calm he had never known. The silence, though foreign, began to reveal its own kind of message. Hermes realized that he had been so focused on fulfilling the needs of others that he had neglected his own. The gods, for all their wisdom and power, were not immune to the pressures of their roles, and Hermes, as a servant of those gods, was no exception. But in this moment, he understood that his own well-being, his own peace, mattered too. As the hours passed, Hermes sat in quiet reflection, pondering what his future might look like if he allowed himself moments of rest. Could he continue to serve the gods with the same dedication if he gave himself space to recharge? Would he lose his sense of purpose if he stopped rushing from one task to the next? In the stillness, Hermes found clarity. His work, though important, was not the sum of his existence. He was more than a messenger. He was a god with his own needs, desires, and moments of weakness. And it was okay to acknowledge those needs. It was okay to rest. As the night deepened and the stars above shimmered like distant beacons of light, Hermes sat in the quiet of his temple, still and reflective. The moments of silence, once so foreign to him, had become a place of revelation. For the first time in centuries, he had allowed himself to simply be. His mind, normally whirling with the speed of his errands and the weight of his responsibilities, had quieted. The restless energy that always surged within him, pushing him forward, had softened. And in that space, Hermes discovered something profound. For so long, he had believed that his worth was defined by his ceaseless movement, his ability to run messages between the gods, to carry out the tasks that no one else could. He was the swift, the messenger, the ever-moving force between worlds. His wings, his sandals, had always symbolized his duty, his role in the cosmic order. But now, in this quiet moment of reflection, Hermes realized that his true strength did not lie in constant motion. It lay in the ability to pause. In the stillness of his temple, he began to understand that rest was not weakness. It was not a luxury for those who had nothing to do. It was a necessary part of existence, a way to replenish the mind and the soul. Even a god as swift as Hermes needed moments of stillness to reflect, to regain his clarity. His work, as vital as it was to the gods and mortals alike, could not be sustained if he did not take time to recharge. As the first light of dawn began to break over Olympus, Hermes rose from his seat, feeling a renewed sense of peace and purpose. He had learned something important. In order to serve the gods and fulfill his duties with the same vigor and dedication, he needed to honor his own needs. The act of pausing, of resting, was not an act of rebellion against his role. It was an act of self-preservation, of wisdom. To continue moving forward, he needed to understand the importance of stillness, of allowing himself to simply be. Hermes, the god of motion, the eternal messenger, would now carry with him a new understanding of balance. He could continue to serve, to run his errands, to carry the messages of the gods, but he would no longer do so at the expense of his own well-being. The restlessness that had plagued him for so long was not an inherent part of who he was. It was simply a byproduct of his refusal to acknowledge the need for rest. As he stepped out of his temple and into the rising sun, Hermes felt lighter, more at peace with himself. He was no longer defined solely by his tasks. He was, after all, more than just a messenger. He was a god, a being with his own desires, his own limits, and his own moments of quiet. And in that realization, Hermes had found a new way to be. The world still needed him, as it always would. The gods still relied on him to carry out their will. But now, Hermes knew that he could continue his work with the same dedication, while also honoring his own need for peace and rest. The balance between motion and stillness, between action and reflection, was the key to his continued strength. Reflection. Hermes' journey toward understanding the importance of rest mirrors the experiences of many who feel driven by constant motion and productivity. The story of Hermes reminds us that even the most energetic, the most active among us, need to recognize the value of stillness. Rest is not a sign of weakness. It is a crucial component of strength. In honoring our need for pause, we can continue our work with greater purpose, clarity, and resilience.